8-year-old Sophie Anders had no idea her life would depend on everything her grandmother had taught her when she stepped out of the old pickup that morning, her boots kicking up little puffs of Wyoming dust, her eyes wide with anticipation. She was excited, buzzing with it, as she clutched her sketchbook under one arm and skipped toward the trailhead that wound through the pine-blanketed hills of the Wind River Range. This was their special place. Every spring since she could remember, her grandmother Martha took her here, 3 days off-grid, no phones, no distractions, just them, the mountains, and the wild. The tradition was sacred, but this year the mountains had other plans. The sky had started out that perfect pale blue, the kind that makes the air feel clean in your lungs and sharp against your skin. Sophie had spent the morning collecting Indian paintbrushes and pointing out every single rabbit track and squirrel trail they passed, her blonde braids bouncing with every step. Martha, weathered and wise, with crow's feet earned from years of squinting into sunrises, kept one eye on her granddaughter and the other on the horizon. She noticed the change first, not in the color of the sky, but in the way the wind shifted. It came in low, cold, sharp, wrong. The trees stopped whispering, the birds stopped singing, and deep in her gut, Martha felt it. Something was coming. Sophie didn't see it yet. She was too caught up in the adventure, too enchanted by the idea of seeing wild horses, which she begged to spot every trip. She asked again that afternoon, wide-eyed and breathless, "Do you think we'll see the Mustangs today?" Her grandmother smiled, the kind of soft, steady smile that held decades of truth. "Maybe, but remember, we don't go near them. They're not ponies, they're wild, proud animals. You watch, you respect, and you never chase." They reached their familiar campsite by mid-afternoon, a cozy clearing near a crystal creek, shaded by towering cottonwoods. Sophie rolled out their tent like a pro, just as she'd been taught, hammering the pegs with a rock while Martha stacked firewood. They didn't notice the clouds thickening behind the ridgeline until a crack of thunder shattered the calm. It didn't rumble, it snapped, close and angry. Then came the wind, furious and sudden. It hit the tent like a slap, tearing it from its stakes and tossing it across the clearing like a toy. "Sophie, grab the emergency pack!" Martha yelled over the roar. Sophie darted forward but slipped in the slick grass as the rain unleashed in a sudden torrent. Thunder cracked again, louder, closer. Then it happened, the kind of moment that splits time. Sophie stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, lost her footing completely, and tumbled down the embankment toward the swollen creek. Martha's scream followed her, but the wind swallowed it. By the time the older woman scrambled after her, Sophie was gone. Just gone. Sophie came to at the edge of the water, dazed, mud smeared across her face, her backpack hanging off one shoulder. Distantly, she heard her name echoing through the trees, but the storm twisted every sound. It was impossible to tell where her grandmother's voice was coming from. Everything was too loud, wind shrieking, water rushing, branches snapping. She picked herself up, head pounding, heart racing. She was alone, in a storm, in the mountains, and she was only 8. For a moment she panicked. She turned in circles, calling out for her grandmother, slipping in the mud again and again, but then something clicked. Somewhere deep inside, her training surfaced. Everything Martha had taught her on these trips, how to stay calm, how to make shelter, how to think like the forest was listening, came rushing back. She remembered what her grandmother said about getting above flood level, about using what you had, about tying yourself to a tree if you were afraid you might pass out from the cold or get swept away. So she climbed. Clumsy, scared, crying but moving, she clawed her way up the ridge and found an old cottonwood tree standing alone on a rise. Its trunk was thick, gnarled, and solid. She pressed herself against it, pulling the emergency space blanket from her backpack and wrapping it tight, though the wind threatened to rip it from her fingers. Her little hands shook as she fumbled with the paracord, tying it around her waist and then around the tree, cinching the knot the way Martha had taught her, so she wouldn't slide away if she lost consciousness. The storm raged. The cold crept in. The darkness came early. She was soaked, trembling, too cold to cry anymore. She whispered, "Grandma will come." But there was no answer, just the wind and the trees. The blanket wasn't enough. Her fingers felt like ice. Her breath came in gasps. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. She didn't know anymore, but as she drifted in and out of awareness, she heard it, a sound unlike the storm, the steady, deliberate thud, thud, thud of hooves approaching through the trees. And then they came. Sophie could barely keep her eyes open. Her body had gone from shivering violently to an eerie stillness, the kind of cold that seeped so deeply into her bones it felt like her limbs no longer belonged to her. The wind had torn at her space blanket until it fluttered like a silver ghost in the branches, half caught, half clinging. The paracord was still tight around her waist, tethering her to the tree, just as her grandmother had taught her. It had felt like the right thing to do at the time, the safe thing. But now, in the pitch-black silence of the mountains, Sophie was no longer sure of anything. The pain in her fingers was fading, but she knew that wasn't a good sign. Somewhere in her mind, a voice that sounded like her grandmother warned her that when the cold stops hurting, it's not because things are getting better, it's because you're slipping away. And then she heard it. Faint at first, muffled by the wind, a rhythm, slow, heavy, deliberate, hooves. It didn't sound like deer. She knew what those sounded like, quick, light, alert. This was different, slower, larger. Each step seemed to land with purpose, crunching frost-covered leaves and snapping twigs underfoot. Sophie tried to lift her head, but her neck muscles barely responded. The wind shifted again, and through the crackling of the storm she saw them. Shadows at first, moving through the trees like ghosts with weight. Dark forms emerging into the faint glow of moonlight pushing through the clouds. Horses, not just one, a herd. She blinked, unsure if her mind was playing tricks on her, but then she saw the one in front, a brown Mustang. Not just brown, but deep, almost copper, with a black mane heavy from rain and eyes that seemed watching, understanding. The mare stepped forward, her hooves sinking slightly into the softened ground. She didn't flinch at the sight of the girl or the scent of human fear. Her ears pricked forward, her breath visible in the cold air as she exhaled. Sophie thought she might be dreaming, because what wild horse in its right mind would approach a human, especially one tangled in rope and plastic? And yet, here she was, real, present, close enough now that Sophie could smell the dampness of her coat and hear the soft snort of her breath. More horses followed, forming a loose semicircle around the cottonwood. They didn't come in fast or nervous like spooked animals. They moved as if drawn, compelled and somehow aware. The brown mare stood only a few feet from Sophie now, her gaze level and calm. She stepped closer, then closer still. Finally, her warm muzzle brushed against Sophie's cheek, soft, slow, deliberate. A simple touch, but it lit something inside the frozen child, a flicker of warmth, a spark of life. The mare lowered herself to the ground beside Sophie, her body resting in the cold mud without hesitation. And then came something no textbook could explain. The Mustangs gathered tightly around the tree, bodies pressing close, forming a living barrier between the girl and the wind. Not moving, not running, just being there. One by one they settled, some standing, some lying down, always keeping a protective distance like soldiers forming a shield wall. And in the center, bound by rope and half-conscious, was a child who should have died hours ago. Sophie, barely awake, felt something shift inside her, not just physically, but deeper. She wasn't alone anymore. The fear that had clutched her chest all night eased ever so slightly. A whisper of safety replaced it. Not warmth exactly, but presence, solid and grounding. She didn't know why the horses were there or what had brought them to her. All she knew was that the brown mare was close, so close she could feel the breath from the animal's nostrils brushing against her hair, gentle as a lullaby. She thought of her mother then, and her father, of the way her grandmother would sing to her at night in their little ranch house, the melody of a song about stars and prairie winds. And now, somehow, she felt like she was being sung to again, not with words, but with presence. The rhythmic sound of hooves shifting, the soft snorts and the rise and fall of breathing, the rustle of tails swishing through the freezing air. It all melted into a kind of harmony. Sophie's eyes drifted closed, not from cold this time, but from something like peace. Miles away, Martha had reached the ranger station, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the pen to sign the report. She kept repeating the same thing over and over. She knows what to do. I taught her. But she's just a little girl. Search and rescue teams were already organizing. The radios were crackling with zone assignments, with talk of terrain and risk and time. Time was the enemy now, because in these mountains, when the sun went down and the cold came up from the earth like a ghost, time didn't forgive. Back at the tree, the Mustangs remained. All night long, they stayed. As the storm rolled on, as temperatures dropped below freezing, as every reasonable part of their animal nature should have told them to flee. But they didn't. The brown mare occasionally nuzzled Sophie's leg or nudged the rope binding her, but gently, as if respecting the girl's strange, chosen shelter. The others shifted positions only to block more wind. Their circle never broke. And when the storm began to fade, when the rain stopped and the first light of dawn crept over the peaks in a silver wash, the most incredible part wasn't that Sophie was still alive. It was that she was alive because of them. At first, the light came slow, pale and reluctant, slipping between the pines like it didn't quite believe the storm was over. The world was still wet, dripping, hushed. Sophie stirred as the faint warmth of morning touched her face, though she remained bound to the old cottonwood by the rope she had tied in the dark. Her fingers were numb, swollen, and stiff. She couldn't feel the knot anymore, couldn't move her hands to undo it, but she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, her heart was still beating. Her breath, shallow, uneven, still came. That should not have been possible, not after a night like that. Not out here in the open with freezing rain and biting wind and no human warmth to shield her. But warmth had come, not from a fire, from something wilder. She didn't open her eyes at first. She listened. The sounds around her weren't human, weren't mechanical. They were soft and rhythmic, like nature breathing. The shift of heavy bodies in wet grass, the low murmur of snorts in quiet nickers, a hoof striking gently against dirt. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, and the sight that met her would never fade. Not in that moment, not for the rest of her life. The herd was still there, surrounding her, every single one of them, a wall of fur and muscle and breath. They had not left her. The brown mare was closest, her body curved protectively along Sophie's side like a massive living blanket. Her flank was pressed so close to the girl's legs that Sophie could feel the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. The mare's head was down, her eyes half closed, not asleep, but calm, watchful, vigilant. Sophie tried to speak but found her voice had faded into a whisper. Her throat was raw from the cold air and from crying out the night before. "Pretty horse," she managed. The mare opened her eyes slowly, shifting just enough to acknowledge her. Not startled, not afraid, just present. It was more than Sophie could have hoped for. The other Mustangs began to move with the light, but not away. They stretched, stomped, shook the rain from their coats, but they didn't break the circle. If anything, they tightened it. They were watching the forest beyond, ears swiveling towards something. Sophie couldn't see what it was, but she sensed it, the change in the herd's posture, the subtle alertness. Something, or someone, was approaching. Up on the ridge above, a woman crouched low behind a scrub of sagebrush, binoculars pressed to her eyes, disbelief scrawled across her face. Eleanor Wade had been tracking the Wind River Mustangs for more than a decade, keeping careful distance, documenting migration patterns and herd behavior with near religious discipline. She lived in a modest cabin tucked into a fold of the land, deliberately away from people, drawn more to the horses than to the humans who disappointed her one too many times. She had come to know each Mustang by sight: Thunderheart, the bold bay stallion with the jagged blaze; Whisper, the shy young filly with a curious tilt to her ears, and the brown mare standing closest to the child now, whom Eleanor had named Ember in her notes, though others simply called her Goldie. What she was seeing now made no sense. None. These horses should have bolted the moment they caught her scent, even from this far away. Instead, they were standing guard over a little girl tied to a tree like she was one of their own. She lowered her binoculars, heart pounding. She had seen storms take full-grown men in these mountains. She had seen what nature could do to anything small, exposed, unprotected. That this child was alive, much less calm, coherent, and clearly being sheltered by a herd of wild horses, was unthinkable. And yet there it was, in front of her. No one would believe it. But she didn't need them to believe her. She needed to act. Eleanor rose slowly, knees protesting, and started down the slope. She made herself small, her movements slow and deliberate. She expected the horses to scatter, to flee the second she crossed the invisible boundary between observer and subject. But they didn't. As she stepped into the clearing, the Mustangs turned to look at her. No panic, no flight, only attention. They were waiting. That was what chilled her. They were waiting for her. The brown mare didn't move. She watched Eleanor approach with those deep, intelligent eyes and stood her ground. The space she had held all night remained hers, but she shifted just enough to allow Eleanor a path to the tree. The message was clear. You may come closer, but only because we allow it. Eleanor crouched beside the girl, her throat catching as she took in the child's pale skin, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the rope dug into her waist where she had tied herself down. "Hey there," Eleanor said softly, not sure who she was addressing more, the child or the mare standing protectively over her. "You're safe now." Sophie's eyelids fluttered. "The horses," she whispered. "They stayed with me." Her words were slow, slurred, but unmistakably real. She wasn't hallucinating. She wasn't imagining things. The Mustangs had saved her. "I see that," Eleanor said, her voice catching. "They did something no one would ever believe, but I believe you, sweetheart. I saw it." She reached gently for the knot in the paracord, working slowly so as not to startle the horses. The rope was slick and frozen, but she managed to untie it, her fingers stiff from adrenaline and disbelief. As it fell away, Sophie slumped slightly, and Eleanor caught her, cradling her gently as she reached for the emergency radio clipped to her belt. She hadn't used it in years, not once since she moved to these mountains. But today wasn't like any other day. "This is Eleanor Wade," she said into the receiver, her voice steady but urgent. "I've found a child near Widow's Creek. She's alive. She needs immediate medical attention." As she waited for the reply, she looked back at the mare. The brown Mustang still stood there, close and calm, her breath misting in the cool morning air. Sophie stirred in Eleanor's arms. "She didn't leave me," she murmured. "She stayed warm. She laid down beside me." Eleanor's breath caught. "I saw her," she whispered. "She didn't just stay. She protected you. They all did." And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Wade, lifelong skeptic, hardened by grief, shaped by solitude, believed in something she couldn't explain. She believed that this child, this herd, and this moment were bound together in a way that defied everything she had ever known about wild animals and the human heart. The silence after a storm isn't peaceful. It's eerie. It's the kind of silence that follows chaos like a shadow, thick and uneasy, as if the land is holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next. That morning, the Wind River Range sat under a blanket of clouds that still hung low, sluggish and bruised from the night's fury. Trees stood dripping, their branches stripped of leaves. Pools of water collected in shallow divots across the earth, reflecting a sky that hadn't yet made up its mind whether to brighten or brood. Somewhere in that battered wilderness, a moment was unfolding that no one could have predicted. 2 miles away, the whir of rotor blades cut through the quiet. A rescue chopper surged over the ridges, banking toward a narrow valley guided by Eleanor Wade's call. At the controls sat a seasoned pilot who had flown extractions during avalanches, fires, and floods, but never anything like this. On the ground below, Eleanor remained kneeling beside Sophie, who had slipped into a fragile doze. Her breathing had steadied, but her skin was pale and mottled with cold. Eleanor kept one hand gently on the girl's back, the other hovering protectively as the brown Mustang, Goldie, as she now instinctively called her, stood just inches away, unmoving, unblinking. The rest of the herd maintained their formation around the clearing, occasionally shifting but never straying. They weren't there by accident. That much Eleanor now believed beyond all doubt. As the sound of the helicopter grew louder, the horses began to stir. Heads raised, ears twitched. A few took uncertain steps back. Thunderheart, the dominant stallion, snorted and stamped his hoof once. Goldie didn't flinch. She merely turned her head slightly, as if acknowledging the intrusion but reserving judgment. Her eyes remained locked on Sophie, who was starting to stir again, confused by the noise, her brow furrowing. Eleanor leaned in close. "Help's almost here," she whispered. "You're going to be okay." Sophie blinked slowly, her voice barely audible. "Are the horses leaving?" Eleanor followed her gaze. "Not yet," she murmured. "They're waiting." The helicopter touched down at a safe distance, blowing a storm of debris across the soaked earth. Paramedics disembarked swiftly, hunched against the downdraft, equipment bags slung across their shoulders. They moved quickly, expertly, but paused in awe when they reached the edge of the circle. Wild horses surrounding a child, not pacing, not panicking, just watching. The disbelief in their eyes mirrored Eleanor's from an hour earlier. She raised a hand, signaling them to approach slowly. Goldie shifted at the movement. One of the medics froze. "Do we need to drive them off?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Don't make sudden moves. Just give them a moment. Let her speak to them." It made no sense, and yet it was working. Sophie, still lying against Eleanor's chest, reached a trembling hand toward Goldie. The mare lowered her head, touching the girl's fingers with her velvet-soft muzzle. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a release. Permission. With that, Goldie stepped back, her hooves careful on the wet ground, and walked calmly to rejoin her herd. As if choreographed, the rest of the Mustangs turned with her and began to move, slowly, gracefully, up the slope toward the tree line. They didn't gallop. They didn't bolt. They left like guardians returning to the mist, glancing back once, then twice, before vanishing into the gray veil of morning. The spell was broken. The paramedics moved in and lifted Sophie gently onto a stretcher, wrapping her in heated blankets, checking her vitals, securing her airway. Eleanor stepped back, suddenly aware of her own trembling. Her hands were covered in mud, her jeans soaked through. But she hadn't noticed until now. Her focus had been entirely on the girl and the horses. She felt hollowed out by the magnitude of what had just happened, but also anchored in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the chopper lifted off, Eleanor watched it rise, her eyes following the spinning blades as the craft disappeared over the ridge. It carried not just a child, but a story so incredible she still wasn't sure it would hold up under scrutiny. But it had happened. She had seen it with her own eyes. A herd of wild Mustangs, creatures born of instinct and flight, had chosen not to run. They had chosen to protect. Back at the ranger station, word had already spread. Radios had lit up with chatter. A child had been found. Alive. A woman, Eleanor Wade, had brought her in. But the details were murky. People filled in the blanks with what made the most sense. They assumed Eleanor had found her huddled beneath a tree, perhaps in a shallow cave, somehow just lucky enough to have made it through the night. No one imagined the truth. Not yet. Hours later, at St. Mary's Hospital in Eagle's Perch, the staff was astonished by Sophie's condition. Hypothermia, yes. Dehydration, certainly. But far less severe than expected for someone who had spent an entire night exposed in the freezing wilderness. The attending doctor, a seasoned man named Howard Riley, kept shaking his head as he examined her. "She should be in far worse shape," he muttered to his nurse. "Frankly, she shouldn't have survived at all, not in those conditions." When asked what happened, Sophie's voice was soft but clear. "The horses saved me," she said. "The brown one stayed closest. She laid down next to me. She kept me warm." The nurse smiled gently. "Sweetheart, you were alone out there. You must have dreamed it." But Eleanor, who had stayed at the hospital to provide her statement, stepped forward. "She didn't dream it," she said quietly. "I saw it. I watched them guard her. I watched them surround her all night. I've been tracking those horses for a decade, and I've never seen anything like it." The nurse looked doubtful, but the way Eleanor spoke, with unwavering certainty, left no room for argument. Outside the hospital, news of the child's survival began to spread, first as whispers among locals, then in louder ripples across the town. But the full story of the wild horses, of the brown mare that stood vigil, of the herd that didn't flee, was still contained within a small circle. That wouldn't last long, but for now it remained sacred, protected, like the girl herself. And in the hills above Eagle's Perch, on a high ridge overlooking the town, the herd reassembled beneath the clouds. Goldie stood at the front, her ears forward, her body still. Thunderheart stood beside her, a sentinel once again, and far below, in the tiny square of hospital light in the valley, a child they had chosen to protect was alive. The sun had barely broken over the Wind River Range when Eleanor Wade stepped out of the hospital into the crisp morning air, her breath fogging in the chill that clung to everything like a memory that refused to fade. The lobby behind her still buzzed with questions, doctors asking how, nurses whispering why, a ranger scribbling in his notebook, eyes narrowed in disbelief. She hadn't answered most of them, not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't. There were things that had happened beneath that cottonwood tree that words simply couldn't hold. What do you say when wild horses behave like sentinels? When a mare with no reason to stay chooses to lie down next to a dying child and give her the only warmth she has left? What language could explain that? She pulled her coat tighter and walked slowly down the sidewalk, the rhythm of her boots tapping out the questions she couldn't answer. Sophie was alive. That was miracle enough. But what haunted Eleanor wasn't the survival. It was the intention, the choice. The moment Goldie had stepped forward, alone at first, not as part of a herd instinct, but as something else, something much older, much deeper. She had looked at Sophie the way Eleanor had once seen her own mare look at a foal that wasn't hers, orphaned in a freak barn accident. She had stepped in when no one else had. And now, decades later, a wild horse had done the same for a child who had no one else in that moment. Eleanor didn't go straight home. She needed to see them again, not just to believe what she had witnessed, but to understand it. She took the narrow trail that skirted the ridge above the valley, her old truck bouncing and coughing on the gravel, until it gave way to a rutted path she hadn't traveled in weeks. She parked at a bend just before the overlook and stepped out, binoculars in hand, her steps careful, reverent. The ridge gave way to a sprawling view of the valley below, and there they were, just as she'd hoped. The herd. 22 Mustangs clustered along the tree line, moving in loose patterns like smoke on the wind. Thunderheart stood tall and watchful on a rise, his powerful frame still, his ears constantly scanning. The young filly Eleanor had nicknamed Whisper paced nervously along the edge of the group, her legs quick, her head low, but her energy vibrant. And Goldie stood apart. Not far, but not within the herd either. She watched the valley below, unmoving. Her head was high, her eyes fixed on something Eleanor couldn't see. She looked expectant. And that was what unsettled Eleanor most, that a horse could look like it was waiting. Eleanor raised her binoculars. Goldie didn't flinch, didn't even glance up, but she shifted slightly, enough that the early light struck her side and Eleanor could see the faint scar along her flank, the one she'd gotten last spring during foaling season. That wound had been the beginning of everything. Goldie had given birth to a still foal that season, a tragic but not uncommon event among wild herds. Eleanor had watched it happen from a distant knoll, helpless to intervene, unwilling to disrupt. She remembered the way the mare had stood over the lifeless form for hours, long after the rest of the herd had moved on. It had broken something in her, and now here she was, only a few months later, offering comfort to a child. Eleanor had seen animals grieve, yes. But this was something else entirely. She lowered the binoculars and sat on a fallen log, her notebook resting on her lap. Years of observations were catalogued in those pages: migration paths, herd dynamics, breeding patterns, neat rows of facts, but nothing in those pages explained what she'd seen the night before. She flipped to a blank page and began to write anyway. Not notes, not data, just thoughts. Goldie did not act like a wild animal last night. She did not react. She chose. She approached the child on her own, without prompting, without fear. The others followed, but she led. She laid down next to the girl and did not move for hours. This is not instinct, this is decision. She paused, staring out at the herd again, then underlined the last line. It was terrifying and exhilarating, because if that was true, if a Mustang could choose compassion, could choose to stay, then they weren't just animals to be managed. They were something more, something that deserved more. Back in town, word of the rescue was spreading. Not the whole truth, of course, only the sanitized version that could be explained in reports. Child found tied to tree. Survivor of a freak storm. Miraculously stable condition. But rumors were already taking root. Someone had seen Eleanor speaking to the horses before the medics arrived. Someone else had heard Sophie mumble about the brown horse who stayed all night. At the local diner, two ranchers debated whether it was possible. One insisted horses would never do that. The other just shook his head and said, "Animals know more than we give them credit for." By afternoon, a small group of reporters had arrived at St. Mary's, asking questions, sniffing around, eager for a headline. "Local girl survives wilderness thanks to horse," one of them joked. "Feels like a Disney movie." But they weren't laughing long, because Eleanor had made a decision on that ridge. She wasn't going to lie. She wasn't going to minimize it. If they asked, she'd tell them what she saw. So when a young journalist cornered her outside the hospital doors, recorder in hand, and asked the inevitable question, "Is it true a herd of Mustangs stayed with the child all night?" Eleanor looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yes, I saw it happen. I was there." The story exploded. That night, Goldie and the herd didn't disappear into the high country as they usually did after a disturbance. They remained close to town, visible on the ridge above Eagle's Perch, and for 3 nights in a row, at the exact same time, they stood there, silent, still, facing the valley, like guardians checking in on the one they had saved. And though no one could explain it, no one could stop watching either. 3 days after Sophie Anders was rescued, the quiet Wyoming town of Eagle's Perch had transformed into something no one could have predicted. What was once a sleepy mountain community, best known for cattle auctions, trout fishing, and its proximity to the Wind River Range, was now a magnet for curiosity. Word had gotten out, just as Eleanor knew it would. And not the diluted version about a child surviving the storm. No, this was something stranger, deeper. The story that spread like wildfire was the one Sophie had told with innocent certainty, that the Mustangs had saved her, that a brown mare had stood over her through the storm, that they had stayed when even humans would have run. At first, people dismissed it as exaggeration, the fantastical product of a scared child's mind. But then the witnesses came forward. Eleanor Wade, a rescue medic, a ranger who arrived minutes after the helicopter lifted off and saw the hoof prints, the enormous number of them packed tight around the tree. And the story became something else entirely, not just a miracle, but a mystery. By the time Sophie was discharged from the hospital, reporters had already begun setting up on the sidewalk outside. Camera crews loitered near the parking lot. The local cafe had renamed its special to the Mustang Miracle Pancake Stack. Every conversation in town, whether at the feed store or the hardware aisle of Miller's Supply, always circled back to the same questions. Did you hear what the girl said? Could it be true? What kind of wild horses act like that? And of course, the one no one said aloud, but everyone was thinking, why her? Sheriff Jim Holcomb, who had known Martha Anders since before Sophie was born, drove them both home that afternoon, insisting on escorting them himself. The ranch was an old place, nothing fancy, weather-beaten, the paint peeling off the porch railings, but it had stood solid for 3 generations. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Sophie's small fingers clutched her grandmother's hand, and her eyes widened at the sight of the cameras clustered just beyond the front gate. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Martha could feel her trembling. "They're not here for you, sweetheart," she whispered. "They're here for the story." But Sophie knew better. She was the story. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of cinnamon from the last pie Martha had made before their trip. Everything was just as they'd left it. The coffee mug on the table, the folded laundry, the quilt tossed over the arm of the couch. But something had shifted. The air was different now, heavier, watching. Sophie went straight to the living room window, climbed onto the old stool by the sill, and stared out toward the far ridge. "Do you think Goldie's okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. Martha exchanged a glance with Sheriff Holcomb, who stood awkwardly near the door. "I think she's just fine," the sheriff said. "Wild horses know how to take care of themselves." "But they took care of me," Sophie replied. "She put her head on me. I could feel her breathing. She was warm." Her voice didn't wobble. It didn't tremble. It was full of conviction. That was what unsettled the adults most. She wasn't telling a story to make sense of trauma. She was remembering, accurately, clearly. Her memory hadn't frayed around the edges like they expected from a child that age. Instead, it had crystallized. As the sheriff left and the house quieted, Martha tucked her granddaughter into a nest of blankets on the couch and brought her a cup of cocoa. Sophie didn't touch it. She was still watching the ridgeline, her little face unreadable. "Grandma," she said finally, "Goldie was sad. I could feel it when she put her head on my legs. She missed her baby." Martha paused, startled. Sophie never talked about her parents, not since the accident that took them. And now, in the stillness of their living room, she was speaking not about herself, but about a horse's grief, as if she'd understood it from the inside. "Sweetheart," Martha began, unsure how to respond. But Sophie was already drifting to sleep, her breathing slow, her expression peaceful. As Martha brushed a strand of hair from her granddaughter's forehead, she couldn't help but wonder, what really happened out there that night? Across town, Eleanor sat alone in her cabin, poring through decades of field notes. The faces of the Mustangs, sketched in charcoal, labeled with names she'd given them, stared up from the pages. Goldie, Thunderheart, Whisper. Their patterns were familiar, their routes memorized. But everything she thought she knew about them now felt incomplete. What Sophie described was impossible, and yet Eleanor had seen it. She had felt it too, that unshakable sense that the mare knew exactly what she was doing. And something else had been gnawing at her all day, the herd's behavior since the rescue. They weren't following their usual patterns. Instead of retreating into the highlands as they normally would after human interference, they had stayed. On the East Ridge, near the town, near Sophie. That alone would be strange. But what unsettled Eleanor most was the timing. Every morning since the storm, just after sunrise, the herd appeared on the ridge. Not moving, not grazing, just watching. 20 minutes. Then they vanished again. On the third morning, Eleanor had hiked out before dawn with her field glasses and waited. Sure enough, right at 6:42 a.m., they emerged. First Thunderheart, then the others, and last, Goldie. They stood in absolute silence facing the town, facing Sophie's house, as if waiting for something, or checking on her. Eleanor had scribbled in her notebook that morning, "They remember, they return. This is not chance." She hadn't told anyone about the observation yet, not even Martha. She wasn't sure how to say it without sounding unhinged. But that evening she picked up the phone anyway. "Martha," she said when the older woman answered, "I need to come by. There's something we need to talk about. Something Sophie might be able to help me understand." When Eleanor arrived the next morning, Sophie was already awake, sitting on the back porch with her sketchbook open on her lap. Her crayons were worn down to stubs. Her small hands moved with certainty, no hesitation in the lines she drew. Eleanor sat beside her slowly, watching. "What are you working on?" Sophie didn't look up. "The ridge," she said, "where they stand." Eleanor's heart skipped. "You see them too?" Sophie nodded. "They come every morning, for me. Goldie wants me to know she's still here." Eleanor felt something shift deep inside her. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't coincidence. Whatever had happened out there in the forest hadn't ended with the storm. It had only just begun. The next few days passed in a haze of reporters, questions, and quiet moments that held a sense of urgency. Each morning the Mustangs appeared on the ridge, and each time Sophie watched them, her small face full of a calm understanding that unnerved everyone around her. She no longer seemed like a frightened child. She seemed connected, as though she had become something else entirely. It was as if the wind itself had whispered something to her during that storm. Each evening the horses faded back into the hills, their figures slowly swallowed by the twilight. The townspeople began to whisper about it, how the Mustangs had returned, not just to the area, but to her. Sophie had become the town's center of attention, though she seemed completely unaware of the sensation she was causing. To her, everything felt natural. The horses had stayed with her, they had protected her, and now they were simply watching over her. She spent her days drawing pictures of them, of Goldie with her golden coat and gentle eyes, of Thunderheart with his proud dark mane flowing, and Whisper, the quiet filly who had always kept her distance. But now, in Sophie's world, they weren't just animals, they were family. Eleanor, on the other hand, felt the pressure mounting around her. The press was relentless. Every story, every article, every interview was about Sophie's miraculous survival, but also about the wild horses. Some stories were harmless, even kind, about a local girl saved by these majestic creatures. But others painted a different picture, one of sensationalism and wild speculation. They spoke of the mysterious bond between the horses and the child, as if there was some strange magic involved. And that was a line Eleanor couldn't cross. She didn't believe in magic. She believed in wild animals, animals who had adapted, endured, and lived in ways humans had long forgotten. These weren't mystical creatures. They were survivors of a harsh world. And yet she found herself wondering what had happened out there that night. What had changed? By the end of the week, the story had grown too big for the town to contain. Eleanor could feel it in the way people looked at her when she passed. They were no longer seeing her as the quiet, solitary woman who studied Mustangs. Now, they saw her as part of something larger, part of a story that had captured the imagination of not just the town, but the whole state. Some of them were excited, others curious. But one thing was clear. The moment the Mustangs had saved Sophie, the clock had started ticking. The world was watching, and soon someone would make a move to claim the story for themselves. It happened just as Eleanor had feared. Henry Blackwood, the wealthy developer who had been quietly eyeing the land around Eagle's Perch for years, stepped into the conversation. His proposal for the Mustang Valley Resort and Spa had been in the works for months, but now, with the national media attention on the Mustangs, he saw an opportunity to push the project through faster. The media frenzy surrounding Sophie and the herd had given him the perfect opening to turn the Wind River Range into a luxury tourist destination. He didn't care about the wild horses, he cared about land, profit, and building his vision for the future. The horses, they were just a convenient hook to reel in investors. But Eleanor wasn't about to let him have it. She had seen firsthand the bond between Sophie and the horses. She had seen the way Goldie had stayed beside her when all reason told the Mustangs should have bolted. She had witnessed a connection that couldn't be explained by facts or figures, a bond that, in her gut, felt like something more than a coincidence. But Eleanor knew the stakes. She knew that Blackwood would do whatever it took to push his plans through. And she knew that if the Mustangs lost their grazing grounds, if they lost their sanctuary in the mountains, it would be the beginning of the end for them. It wouldn't just be about land rights. It would be about stripping away everything that made the herd who they were. Eleanor arrived at the town hall meeting with her mind set. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The public hearing had been called to discuss Blackwood's proposal, and as she took her seat near the front, she could already feel the tension. The ranchers were there, of course. Some were intrigued by the idea of a resort that could bring tourists and money to the area. Others, like Frank Davis, were more skeptical. He'd been in these mountains his whole life, and he didn't trust anyone who wanted to mess with the land. The environmentalists were there too, standing shoulder to shoulder with locals who felt the same way. But the eyes of everyone in the room were on one thing: Sophie Anders, the child whose survival had given the town a momentary brush with fame, the child whose connection with the Mustangs had become the subject of rumors and whispers. Everyone wanted to know what she would say. Sophie, however, hadn't wanted to be there. She didn't understand why people were so fascinated with her story. To her, it had been simple. The horses had been there. They had kept her safe. It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like something natural. She had only agreed to come because her grandmother had asked, because Sophie, in all her 8 years, trusted Martha more than anyone. So when it was her turn to speak, she stood beside Eleanor, her little hand clutching the older woman's, and looked out at the crowd. She wasn't nervous, not at all. She simply said, "The horses saved me. They stayed with me all night." Eleanor watched as people exchanged glances. Some nodded, others frowned, but there was no denying the clarity in Sophie's voice. There was something about the way she spoke that made it impossible to write her off as a confused child. There was a conviction, a certainty that rippled through the room. The truth, raw and untouched, hung in the air between them. Then Henry Blackwood stood up. He smiled that practiced smile of his, the one that didn't reach his eyes. He was a tall man, smooth, with perfectly combed hair and a suit that looked like it had never seen a single drop of sweat. He spoke, his voice rich with confidence, making promises of jobs, prosperity, and progress. "We are on the brink of something incredible here," he said, gesturing to the glossy presentation slides behind him. "A world-class resort, a sanctuary for the horses, where they will be cared for, preserved, and a place where people from around the world can come to experience them. Can't we all agree that these horses deserve better than a life of hardship in the wild?" The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. The idea of a sanctuary sounded appealing, at least to the untrained ear. Who wouldn't want to see these magnificent animals up close? But Eleanor saw through it. She had spent too many years observing these Mustangs to be fooled by a conservation pitch. Blackwood's resort wouldn't just bring in tourists, it would carve up the land. It would split the herd's migration paths, make their grazing grounds smaller, more confined, and ultimately it would break the very spirit of the Mustangs. Without hesitation, Eleanor stood. The room quieted. "I've spent years studying these horses," she said, her voice steady. "What I've witnessed in the past few days isn't just about a child's survival. It's about something deeper. These horses protect their own. They protect each other. And they protect the land that has been theirs long before we ever came along. This land, this place, this valley, is a part of them. If we disrupt that, we lose more than a herd. We lose a piece of our history. We lose the soul of this mountain." Her words hung in the air. No one spoke. No one dared to respond. Because deep down, everyone knew she was right. The Mustangs weren't just wildlife. They weren't just part of the ecosystem. They were guardians of something older, something wiser. They had lived here longer than anyone could remember, and if their home was destroyed for the sake of luxury hotels and golf courses, then everything that had made this place wild, untamed, would be gone. Eleanor's voice softened as she turned to Sophie. The Mustangs are more than a spectacle. They're a symbol of freedom, and they deserve to stay that way. Blackwood's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He knew he had his work cut out for him, but he wasn't going to back down. The game had only just begun. The days after the town hall meeting passed in a strange, unrelenting rhythm, each one feeling heavier than the last, like the weight of an inevitable storm hanging in the air. As much as Eleanor wanted to believe that the meeting had made a difference, that the room full of people had understood the gravity of the situation, she knew the truth. Henry Blackwood wasn't going to back down so easily. He was smooth, calculated, and he had resources that stretched far beyond what the people of Eagle's Perch could compete with. She had seen that kind of ambition before. It was the kind of ambition that didn't bend, didn't care about old traditions or wild horses or the stories of small-town folk. All it cared about was expansion, profit, control. And Eleanor knew that as the days passed, Blackwood would only intensify his efforts to push the project through. But it wasn't just him she had to worry about anymore. The town was divided. The ranchers, those who had lived and breathed the land for generations, were beginning to listen. Some of them, like Frank Davis, still held tight to their belief that Blackwood's vision was a danger. Others, who had always seen land as an asset to be developed, were beginning to waver. They had started to see the potential. A resort could bring jobs, infrastructure, and tourism. They imagined the land transformed, golf courses stretching beneath the vast Wyoming sky, cabins nestled in the valley, and trails lined with visitors eager to see the wild Mustangs. They didn't see what it would do to the heart of the land, to the spirit of the place, to the Mustangs themselves. But Eleanor did. She couldn't help but see the picture clearly. The long lines of fences, the paths of the herd broken by roads and buildings, the horses confined to a small corner of their ancestral home, their freedom slowly suffocated by the encroaching presence of mankind. Sophie, for her part, remained unshaken. She continued her routine as if nothing had changed, drawing horses in her sketchbook, watching the Mustangs from the window each morning, speaking to them as though they were her constant companions. It was as though the storm had never happened, like the world outside had not changed in the slightest. She didn't understand the looming threat, didn't know how deeply the people around her were beginning to worry, but Eleanor couldn't ignore it. She watched the way people talked behind closed doors, how they passed by her with cautious glances, unsure whether to speak their minds or keep silent. And then came the rumors. They began quietly at first, whispers at the diner, murmurs in the post office. They said the Mustangs were growing more aggressive, that the herd was becoming too familiar with humans. Some claimed they had been seen near the outskirts of town, watching people in the fields, standing in the middle of roads as if daring anyone to move them. Others said that Sophie's connection to them wasn't just innocent. Some even wondered if she was controlling them. That thought unsettled everyone. After all, a child, especially one who had been through such an ordeal, couldn't just be communicating with wild horses. They couldn't be following her, staying around her, as if they had made a pact. Eleanor knew better than to believe the rumors. She had watched the herd for too long to buy into hysteria. But the stories began to take on a life of their own, and soon even the most rational people started to question what they'd seen. Was it really possible for horses to behave in such a way? Could they truly recognize a child as one of their own, as someone they needed to protect? And if they could, what did that mean for their future? What would happen if the land was taken from them? Would the horses leave, or would they fight to stay? As the days passed, the pressure on Sophie grew. Not from the horses, who still appeared each morning as they had before, but from the people. They wanted to hear from her. They wanted to know what she had experienced, what she had felt. The media started to hound her, sending cameras and reporters to the Anders Ranch every day. They asked questions she didn't have answers to, questions about the horse's mysterious behavior, about how she communicated with them. Sophie, though, remained steadfast. She wasn't interested in answering their questions. She wasn't interested in being a spectacle. She just wanted to be with the horses, to draw them, to feel their presence beside her. But as the pressure mounted, even her grandmother could see the toll it was taking on the child. The quiet nights that once allowed Sophie to heal and process had been replaced by sleepless hours, her mind weighed down with too much. She had become a symbol, and Sophie wasn't old enough to know what that meant. By the time the following week rolled around, Blackwood had ramped up his efforts. He brought in consultants, experts, environmental impact studies, papers, reports, figures that painted a picture of progress and prosperity. And though no one in the room could deny the economic appeal, there was something disconcerting about the way Blackwood's people began to present the Mustangs. They were no longer creatures to be protected. They were an attraction, a resource. In one of his meetings with the town council, he made it clear, "We'll keep the horses, but they won't roam free anymore. We'll create a preserve for them. A sanctuary, yes, but one that'll be carefully managed. We'll control access. We'll allow people to observe them safely. For the horses, it's a better life. No more harsh winters, no more danger from predators. They'll be taken care of." To the untrained ear, it sounded reasonable, but to Eleanor and to the few who truly understood the land and the wild animals who called it home, it was a death sentence. The Mustangs didn't need a sanctuary. They didn't need a place to be managed. They needed space. They needed the freedom to roam, to follow the paths their ancestors had carved out over centuries. A sanctuary would be a gilded cage, a place where the Mustangs were stripped of everything that made them wild. And so the battle continued. Blackwood's proposals gained traction. His investors were interested. His plans were moving forward. The council had been swayed. They began talking about ways to compensate for the disruption to the Mustangs' habitat. Perhaps they could set aside other areas of land, purchase grazing rights from neighboring ranches, but no one knew what that would look like or how it would affect the ecosystem. What was clear was that the developers didn't care. The herd's existence was a formality to them, a selling point for their resort, and soon the town would be forced to decide. It would be the Mustangs or the resort. One had to go. Eleanor found herself in the thick of it, trying to organize a defense. She gathered her notes, decades of observations, migration maps, herd behavior studies, but it wasn't enough. The scientific community, for the most part, had dismissed her theories about the Mustangs' intelligence, their emotional capacity. They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't stood in the clearing as Goldie circled protectively around a child, as the herd stood guard like sentinels, as they gave their warmth without hesitation. And yet she knew it would take more than words to stop Blackwood. It would take action. As the deadline for public comment approached, Eleanor reached out to the only person she trusted to help her make sense of the mounting chaos. Dr. Rebecca Collins, a wildlife biologist she'd met years ago during a research trip to a neighboring region. Rebecca was practical, sharp-minded, and willing to consider evidence even if it didn't fit the typical mold. "We need to put together a formal study," Eleanor said over the phone. "Something to counter Blackwood's claims. We need evidence, something that will force the town to reconsider the development." Rebecca hesitated, then sighed. "You're right. But this isn't just about the horses anymore. It's about their land. The entire ecosystem depends on it. If Blackwood gets his way, it's not just the Mustangs who lose out, it's everything." Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight of her own resolve harden. "I know. I've been watching these horses for years, and I've never seen anything like this before. If we don't act now, we lose everything." In the days that followed, they set the plan into motion. They reached out to the Shoshone tribe, whose ancestors had lived in the area long before settlers arrived. The tribe's elders were hesitant at first, but once they heard Sophie's story and the evidence Eleanor had gathered, they agreed to help. They would testify at the next public meeting, offering their own testimony about the horses' significance in their cultural history. and with the tribe's support, Eleanor knew they had a chance. The town was about to be forced into a decision, and it wouldn't just be about what kind of development they wanted, it would be about what they were willing to sacrifice to get it. Would they sell out to the highest bidder, or would they fight to preserve the soul of the Wind River Range, the land and the wild horses that had called it home for centuries? The future of Eagle's Perch and the Mustangs depended on it. The town hall meeting arrived sooner than expected, and with it came an atmosphere so thick with tension that it almost felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Word had spread fast. This was it, the day the town would choose its future, and the future of the Wind River Mustangs. There were more people than ever packed into the meeting room. The wooden benches were full, and people stood in the back, spilling out into the hallway. No one wanted to miss this. No one wanted to be left out of a decision that could change their community forever. Henry Blackwood was already there, his presence commanding attention as usual. His tailored suit, immaculate as always, seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights. He stood at the front, holding his usual air of calm confidence. This was his game. He had spent years planning for this moment, and now it was all coming together. Behind him, a glossy presentation showcased the future of the Mustang Valley Resort. Luxury cabins, spas, horseback riding trails, golf courses, and most notably, the Mustang Sanctuary that would make it all possible. Blackwood was a master of presentation, always selling a dream, a vision. He knew how to tug at people's heartstrings and make them believe they were part of something grand, something that would uplift the entire community. But today, Eleanor Wade was determined to make sure his vision wasn't the only one being sold. She had spent the last week, sleepless and restless, organizing her thoughts, her research, her evidence, and most importantly, the testimony of the tribe's elders. She knew she didn't have the funds, the influence, or the smooth-talking Blackwood had, but she had something more important: the truth. The Mustangs weren't just wildlife. They weren't just an attraction. They were guardians of the land. They were connected to this place in ways no one could fully understand. And if the town made the wrong decision, it wouldn't just be the Mustangs who would suffer, it would be the land itself, the very spirit of the Wind River Range. As the meeting began, the mayor called for silence, and for a brief moment the room settled into a tense stillness. People whispered nervously, glancing at their neighbors, unsure of where to stand, but everyone knew it was coming. The hard questions, the choice. Blackwood's team was ready, but so was Eleanor. "I'll start with the good news," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as butter. "Eagle's Perch stands on the brink of an extraordinary opportunity. The Mustang Valley Resort is ready to break ground. Our development plans will create hundreds of jobs, bring in millions of dollars in tourism, and put this town on the map. It's not just about preserving the Mustangs. It's about transforming this town into a destination for people around the world. This is a chance to build the future." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the crowd nod, some with eager expressions. He was doing what he did best, selling a vision, and to some it was hard to argue against. Who could resist the promise of jobs, growth, and progress? But then Eleanor stood. The silence in the room deepened. She was an older woman, weathered by years of fieldwork and solitude. But when she spoke, her voice cut through the air, clear and unwavering. "I've spent decades studying the Wind River Mustangs," she began. "I've watched them survive storms, droughts, and predators. I've seen their herd dynamics, their migration patterns. They've roamed these mountains for generations, and they're still here today because they are wild. Not a spectacle for tourists, not a resource to be managed. They are part of this land, and they need their freedom." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. "What you see in front of you is not just a herd of horses. This is a relationship between the horses, the land, and the people who have lived here for centuries. The Mustangs don't just belong to us, they belong to the land. And this land has been their sanctuary long before any of us arrived. Taking that away will be a crime against the spirit of this place." The room was still. Some of the ranchers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor's words had hit a nerve. But before anyone could respond, one of Blackwood's team members stood, ready to counter. "With all due respect, Miss Wade," he said, "we're not proposing to destroy the Mustangs. We're offering them a sanctuary, a space where they'll be protected from the harsh realities of the wild. With proper management, we can ensure they thrive, and the town thrives with them." Eleanor shook her head, her expression firm. "You don't understand," she said, her voice unwavering. "The Mustangs are not meant to be managed. They are meant to roam freely. Their behavior, their survival instincts, everything about them is shaped by this land, by the way they move through it. If you fence them in, confine them to a limited space, they will lose everything that makes them wild. You're not preserving them, you're domesticating them. And once that happens, we lose something much bigger than a herd of horses. We lose the last piece of true wildness left in these mountains." There was a murmur of agreement from the back of the room. A few of the ranchers who had initially supported Blackwood's plan were now looking uncertain. They had never considered the Mustangs in such a way before. Eleanor had taken something they thought they understood, something they thought was theirs, and shown them that they had no right to decide its fate. But Blackwood wasn't about to give up. "Miss Wade," he said smoothly, "we're talking about the future of this town. The Mustangs can't live on the land alone. They need to be part of something bigger. I've already secured backing from investors who believe in this project. The preserve will offer a chance for people to see the Mustangs up close, to learn about their history and the way they live. It will bring in visitors, revenue. It will put Eagle's Perch on the map. Don't you think that's worth something?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about a preserve, but I'm talking about freedom. You can't put a price tag on that. You can't cage something that's never known a fence." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had come to hear her speak. "You have a choice, all of you. You can choose to sell out to someone who sees nothing but dollars in this land, or you can fight for something that's worth far more than any resort could ever offer. These horses, this land, this legacy, it's ours to protect, or it's ours to lose. And once it's gone forever." The silence in the room grew heavier. The crowd was divided, but Eleanor's words had made an impact. The ranchers who had supported Blackwood were no longer so certain. They were looking at each other now, questioning the assumptions they had made. The idea of a luxury resort had been so enticing, so simple, but now it felt more like a lie. The mayor stood then, his face grim as he addressed the crowd. "We've heard from both sides. It's clear this isn't a simple decision. This town has always prided itself on its way of life. But we also need to think about the future. We'll take a vote tomorrow, but until then, we need to hear from everyone. Speak your truth. Let's not rush this." Eleanor sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. She had said everything she could. It was now up to the town. Would they listen to the truth she had shared, or would they succumb to the promises of wealth and growth? Would they sell out to Blackwood's vision, or would they choose to protect the land that had given them so much for so long? The tension in the room was palpable. No one knew how the vote would go. But one thing was certain: the fight for the Mustangs was far from over, and it would take more than just words to save them. The night before the vote, the atmosphere in Eagle's Perch was heavy. The small town had never seen such division, such tension, as the weight of the decision ahead loomed over every conversation. Those who had always prided themselves on the simplicity of mountain life, ranchers, shop owners, and the quiet townsfolk, now found themselves standing at a crossroads. For years, the Mustangs had been part of the landscape, an untamed symbol of the wild spirit of the Wind River Range. But tomorrow they would have to choose: preserve the Mustangs and risk the future of the town, or let them go and trade their freedom for a resort that promised riches but threatened the very soul of the land. Inside the Anders ranch house, the mood was somber. Sophie had already gone to bed, exhausted from the day's events, But Martha couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, looking out at the darkened mountains, her thoughts racing. She had never imagined she would be part of something like this. She had lived her life quietly, keeping to herself, raising Sophie in the remote solitude of the valley. But now, everything had changed. The Mustangs had saved her granddaughter, and in doing so, they had become a symbol of something far larger than the tiny town of Eagle's Perch. It was as if the wild spirit of the mountains had come to life and was demanding to be heard. Eleanor had called earlier that evening, as she had every night since the meeting. There had been little progress on her side. The tribe's elders had offered their support, but the political climate was shifting, and Blackwood had become more determined. He had hired a PR firm, launched an aggressive campaign to paint himself as the town's savior, the one who would bring wealth and prosperity. He wasn't just offering a resort anymore, he was offering the future, and that was a powerful argument in a town where the economy had seen better days. As the sun set behind the mountains, Martha thought back to the conversation she had had with Sheriff Holcomb earlier that afternoon. "It's not just the land they want," Jim had said. "It's control. Once they own the valley, they own everything. The Mustangs, the future of this place, everything. They'll shape it however they want, and people are going to buy into it. People always do." Martha had asked him what he thought the town should do. He had looked at her with a weariness she hadn't seen before, as though the decision had already been made long ago, and all that remained was to play out the inevitable. "I don't know, Martha," he'd said, his voice quiet. "I've seen it happen too many times. Big money, big promises, and everything else gets bulldozed." The sheriff was right. Martha had known deep down that the town was going to be swayed by the promise of progress. She had heard the talk in the diner, seen the faces of the ranchers who were beginning to soften in their opposition. What Blackwood offered was an easy fix to a community that had struggled for too long, but she couldn't bring herself to accept it. Not after what Sophie had been through. Not after the Mustangs had saved her life. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Martha heard the faint sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment she wondered if it was a trick of the wind, but no. It was real. The horses were out there. She couldn't see them, but she felt their presence as strongly as if they were right outside the door. It was as though the land itself was calling to her. She walked out onto the porch, the cool night air biting at her skin. There, just beyond the fence line, she could see the dark silhouettes of the Mustangs. Goldie stood in the lead, her coat nearly glowing in the moonlight, followed by Thunderheart and the rest of the herd. They were watching her, waiting. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a dream. "Martha!" a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Eleanor standing at the edge of the porch, her face pale but determined. "They're here. Again." Martha nodded slowly. "I know. I can feel them." Eleanor stepped forward, standing beside her, both women staring at the Mustangs. "You think they know what's happening tomorrow?" Martha shook her head, her thoughts tangled. "I don't know, but I feel it. They're here because they know, they understand. We don't have to say a word, but they know what's at stake." Eleanor sighed, her breath visible in the cold air. "If only we could convince the town. But it's not just about the horses anymore. It's about everything. Blackwood's got too much power, too many people listening to him now. I don't think we can win this. At least, not with the truth alone." Martha looked over at her friend, a mix of sadness and resolve in her eyes. "We have to try. It's all we have left." The two women stood in silence, each feeling the weight of the decision that hung in the air. The Mustangs were still out there, quietly observing, a reminder of the land's untamed spirit. No one could deny the beauty of the valley, the strength of the wild horses that called it home. But they were more than just beautiful creatures. They were a part of something much bigger. They were the guardians of the land, and if the town let Blackwood take that away, they would lose something far greater than the Mustangs themselves. The following morning, the town hall meeting was set to begin early. The streets of Eagle's Perch were already alive with activity as the townsfolk gathered to make their voices heard. Martha and Eleanor arrived at the courthouse, standing side by side as they entered the building. The atmosphere inside was electric. The room was packed with people, local ranchers, business owners, environmentalists, and a group of reporters who had arrived from the city. At the front of the room, Blackwood's representatives were already seated, their faces stern and expectant. They had come prepared, ready with their legal teams and presentation slides, their slick brochures outlining every benefit of the resort. But there was something different in the air today. The energy was more charged than it had ever been. People weren't just divided, they were determined. Martha felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she took her seat. She glanced at Sophie, who was sitting quietly beside her, clutching her sketchbook as always. Sophie didn't fully understand what was going on, but there was a sense of knowing in her eyes. It was as though she too felt the weight of what was at stake. As the meeting began, the mayor called for silence, and Blackwood stood to speak first. His voice rang out confidently as he presented his case, repeating the same promises of prosperity, jobs, and economic growth. The crowd listened attentively, but there was a noticeable shift in the room. More people were skeptical. They were no longer enamored with the idea of luxury resorts and tourism. They had begun to see the cost of it. And as Blackwood's presentation droned on, it became clear that they weren't just concerned about losing the land. They were afraid of losing something more precious. Eleanor stood up next. Her voice was calm, but there was a strength in it that rang out across the room. She spoke about the Mustangs as she had before, about their history, their role in the ecosystem, and their connection to the land. She spoke of the bond Sophie had formed with them, of the way they had protected her, of the wisdom they carried in their hooves and hearts. She spoke of the land's sacredness, of the ancient connection between the Shoshone people and the Mustangs. And as she spoke, something shifted in the room. People began to listen. But when Sophie was called to speak, the room went silent. She stood up, her small figure walking to the front of the room, her head held high. She looked at the crowd, her eyes clear, unfazed by the sea of faces. "Goldie and the other horses saved me," Sophie said simply, her voice strong. "They didn't leave me. They stayed with me, and they kept me warm when I was cold. They're not just animals, they're family. They're part of this place, just like we are." Sophie's words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. The entire room was locked in a kind of stunned silence. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. Some were nodding in agreement. Others were exchanging uncertain glances. Sophie had said it, plainly and without hesitation. It wasn't just about the Mustangs being saved, it was about them saving her. They were part of something that couldn't be bought or sold. The decision was about to be made. Would the town choose to preserve what was sacred and true, or would they bow to the pressure of Blackwood's promises? As the final votes were cast, the room held its breath. The fate of the Mustangs and of the land they had protected for centuries rested in the balance. It was then that the doors of the courtroom creaked open and the last of the Mustangs appeared. They were standing on the ridge, just beyond the window, watching the meeting unfold. Goldie's gaze was fixed on the building, and for a moment it felt as though time had stopped. The horses were waiting, just as they always had.